Well, good evening. Is this working? Yep, very good. Thank you very much, Darren, not only for the introduction, but also for the invitation. I am very happy to be here. I was telling Darren I haven't been here since 2011, where you invited me to lecture as well. And it's always great to be here. It's always great to be in the Phoenix-Tucson mega region, which is actually a geography that I've done a lot of work research in. So very happy to be here. Today I actually want to present more in detail one specific project which has to do with the introduction of the new metro line, a brand new metro line in the city of Quito in Ecuador. And I'll go into that sort of towards the second half of the lecture. But before I actually sort of talk about the project in detail, I want to first give a general overview of how I see the discipline of architecture and what is the platform from which I actually both practice and teach architecture and design. And we could basically summarize that there are three particular sort of components to my practice: professional practice through Somatic Collaborative, applied research through the South America project and the research platform that I've set up at the GSD at Harvard. And then, of course, teaching the day-to-day pedagogy and primarily studio pedagogy, which is something that that is very important for the process. In many ways, I think that professional practice forces you to be extremely synthetic, forces you to make certain decisions and test certain hypotheses. I think applied research in many ways allows you to open particular avenues of research, particular questions, without the strictures of billable hours and certain constraints that that practice has. And in many ways, teaching, and by teaching, I generally refer enormously to sort of the core foundation of a particular curriculum, also allows you to, in many ways, sort of reflect on the instrumental and methodological diversity of the disciplines of design in relation to the built environment. So I'll start briefly sort of explaining a little bit about my professional practice. I always like to start with these two slides because it shows the smallest project we've ever done and the largest project which, that we have done. The smallest is the entry gate to a series of art gardens in Quito, Ecuador, the Santa Rosa Gardens. And on the right, it's a very large research study funded by the Ford Foundation that looks at issues of urbanization along the Ganges River. And I think I always like to show these two because for me, and for us, along with my partner, Anthony Echavati, in the practice, we are actually more interested in cutting across scales and understanding as architects how we can actually shift and from one scale to the other, and how one scale informs the other, rather than be, so we'd rather be amateurs across scales than experts in a single scale. And I think that this is something we've consistently pushed throughout our work. I think in that context, I think our work also focuses enormously on sort of a broad array of scenarios that range all the way from sort of the restructuring and the transformation of projects within the consolidated city. In this case, this is the transformation for the Plaza República, which is a project we finished the design about a year ago, and now it's in it's in the process of municipal approval. And this is the transformation of a plaza in the adjacent to the government building for the province of Pichincha in Ecuador. To other projects that begin to look at the relationship between architecture and territory. In the recent year, we've been doing a lot of work with the flower industry in Ecuador, primarily looking at. Is there a pointer somewhere around here? Oh, I can. You know what? I can use the mouse. That problem solved. Looking at the flower industry along the equator. And for me, this map is actually very, very telling because it actually shows sort of all the major flower production, primarily roses, that happens on high altitude geographies across the equator, and all the markets where they are actually being exported. If you actually sort of buy any sort of bouquet of flowers at a store, those flowers have flown more than most people. In general, they come from Ecuador, Colombia, or Kenya and Ethiopia in Africa. And the reality is that sort of this larger global global market network is completely transforming a very fertile artisanal agricultural land into a broad set of agro-industrial complexes, where sort of land that's primarily being used for that was used primarily for agriculture today is being used for a luxury good. And in this context, we're actually developing a series of projects. The first one has to do with the development of an agro-industrial park, making sort of flower growers agree that they're better off sharing a series of post-harvest resources, and that these post-harvest resources, instead of being repeated inside each of the farms, they can actually be consolidated in terms of a shared park that might also begin to introduce certain services and facilities for the larger community, including housing, educational facilities, recreational facilities, to be able to sort of in many ways make of the agro-industrial complex a larger, sort of more urban shared park. As part of this project, this is one of the first pieces that's being built, which is a post-harvest research lab and museum. And I think part of the objective of moving towards this shared park is also the idea of introducing the flower industry into the larger culture of the country. That people can actually go in the same way that they actually go sort of on wine tours, that they can actually go on flower tours, and that the this resource extraction industry that primarily sort of is seen as an export industry that leaves nothing behind in the geographies where the flowers are being grown, can actually develop alternative industries. As part of our research through the office, in this case through a Grant Foundation grant, we've been looking also to the relationship of larger material forces and environmental forces in the context of fast-paced urbanization. Some of you might recognize what that is, and we've spent a lot of time sort of looking at the relationship of the 1 square mile grid and the possibility of new models of urbanism that relate to sort of the larger geography, primarily of water, and new models of settlement along the Phoenix-Tucson mega region. In many ways, exploring for new formats that can actually reconfigure the 1 square mile block. And then I think I want to sort of finish this brief introduction on practice on sort of with this project, the Ganges Water Machine, which was a project funded by the Ford Foundation 10 years ago. It's primarily been led by my partner that looks at the processes of urbanization along the Ganges River. The Ganges River, of course, one of the major rivers in India, is in the province of Uttar Pradesh. Not necessarily considered a city, but the province actually has the surface of England and the population of Brazil. So in many ways, the government is extremely worried and concerned about the state of the river, which is both a huge source of pollution, because a lot of the industry in the region sort of drains into the water, but it is also a god. So this sort of the figure of sort of basically the drainage of the province and also a religious deity creates a very sort of complex settlement pattern in which people actually believe that the water is extremely pure. It's basically a religious element, and nothing's going to happen to them if they drink it or if they bathe in it. So this relationship between ritual and industry has caused huge conflicts along this major infrastructure. And part of our work was actually to develop mechanisms to sort of begin to map this dynamic atlas and understand how, in many ways, the areas outside of the consolidated river, along the riverbank, become really the main staging grounds for urbanization. In terms of applied research, we've also developed a series of projects, primarily that look sort of along a year-long, sort of 1 or 2 year long timeframes that begin to look at particular geographies and primarily at the relationship of architecture, design, and infrastructure across these geographies. One of them is this project titled A Line in the Andes, which looks at the introduction of the first metro line ever built in the city of Quito, Ecuador. And what does it actually mean, and what are the implications of a $2.5 billion investment in a city that basically has no rail culture? And I'm not going to go more into detail right now because this is the main project I want to explain today, so we'll get back to this project in a second. In a similar manner, we've also just finished a project on Mexico City. This is what Darren was mentioning in the introduction. Mexico City between geometry and geography. This was a project sponsored by ICA, Ingenieros Civiles Asociados, which is the main infrastructure engineering office in all of Mexico. Most of the major highways, markets, canals, water drainage infrastructure that you see in the city has actually been built by ICA. And they actually called us because they're extremely worried. This, for me, it's important to mention. They were extremely worried about the city they've built. And in many ways, not unlike many other large cities, they've actually focused on very large monofunctional infrastructures, singular infrastructures, that if, in fact, have resolved certain problems at one particular scale, they have also created an extremely divided and fragmented city. And this, of course, is extremely well known by the peripheral ring, which I'll show in a second, which is this double-decker ring, a freeway that basically goes all around the city, that now they're building the second level, and there's some discussion to build a third level, even though it's, at this moment, I think there's not enough political momentum for it. But basically, they called us because the city is planning on introducing 4 new monorail lines. And they really wanted to see how can you actually begin to think about the introduction of 4 monorail lines in a manner that they might be able to move from sort of simple, singular monofunctional infrastructures, right? Infrastructures that have only one use. You know, I build a highway and it's only to move cars, into something that could serve as the backbone for a much larger and integral urban vision. And here you see the 4 lines, 2 that connect the area of the existing airport, which will be the former airport soon, which is where a large percentage of the population of the working force lives, with the new district of Santa Fe, which is in a way the new downtown. And others that connect the main railway station in the north of the city with the area where the UNAM, where the public university is, creating a new corridor north-south. And in many ways, the corridor east-west is the most important one, because while the geometries of the city, and you'll see this as I begin to explain the project, were much more generous north-south, the vast majority of the people have to move east-west. It's one of those sort of unfortunate things that happen in cities, which is that the geometries don't always coincide with the needs. So they're basically hoping to introduce these 2 lines. And we actually started the project by looking at the right-of-way of these 2 lines, but also arguing that these 2 lines would benefit enormously from providing a certain degree of express service in areas where they actually overlap with existing subway lines, and then be much more local as they move towards the edge. So the beginning of the project looked at this issue of mobility infrastructure, but for us, not for ICA, but for us, as part of the research, we were much more concerned with understanding what is the role of architecture and what is the role of design in synthesizing a city that by many has been deemed as a monster that's unmanageable. And I think that it's fine for a lot of people to describe cities as monsters, but architects can't do that. Architects, it's our job to be able to figure out ways in which we can actually make them understandable, in which we can actually bring synthesis from this chaos, and to therefore be able to provide ideas that can actually help us restructure and reorganize these geographies. So of course, I always like to show this image because it seems like this extremely expansive and uncontrolled set of spreads and densities. But actually, if you begin to look at it much more carefully, one second, there we go. if you begin to look at it much more carefully, you can begin to see two issues that are extremely important in relation to the introduction of new infrastructure. One is that the periférico ring, this is the ring that I was talking about, which sort of defines the center of Mexico in relationship to its larger sort of metropolitan area, in a way is a key piece in this larger sort of introduction of the two monorail lines. And it is actually a key piece because it ties together a very large number of major urban and infrastructural artifacts. Some of them which are extremely well used every day, like the Chapultepec Park. Nobody's going to touch the Chapultepec Park except sort of to continue improving it. But others, like the old airport, like the Central de Abastos, that actually need to be rethought. All of these large pieces of infrastructure need to be rethought, and it can actually expand, be reorganized, and in many ways, the introduction of these new two monorail lines should also serve to begin to coordinate how you actually begin to improve certain derelict, certain abandoned infrastructures in the city. And here you begin to see the role of the lines with existing metro line in relationship to this land that in many ways, in many moments, is actually up for grabs for the introduction of new densities, primarily new housing, for the reorganization of the distribution of food, in the case of the wholesale market, and so on. And here you can begin to see some of these photographs. This is a photograph in the 1950s of the existing airport when it was sort of recently built. This is an airport that's going to be decommissioned in 2 years. What do you actually do with this piece of land? Other spaces like the Central de Abastos. This is the largest wholesale market in the world. In many ways, Mexico as a country is an extremely centralized nation. Most of the food that gets distributed in many parts of the country actually crosses through here. When they actually built the Central de Abastos, which was built by the engineering company that sponsored the project, they actually had to hire the military to be able to deliver the infrastructure on time because it was way too big to be built by a private company. But today, of course, the nature of food distribution has actually changed drastically. So the question is, do you actually need this footprint still in the middle of the city? So in many ways, these were a lot of the issues that we were sort of examining within the project that then began to yield a series of interventions at an intermediate scale that would actually then transform or use the monorail line as an epicenter for a series of intermediate scale strategies that could actually help requalify certain conditions in the city. Of course, one of the first and most obvious ones that we were actually looking at had to do with the moments where the monorail aligns with the periférico, and the possibility that the city might develop certain air right strategies that would allow them to bridge the relationship between the inner ring and the outer ring. And in fact, it's well known. I mean, Paris, I think, is one of the best examples of this, where the périphérique, the idea of a city ring, begins to choke the center. And I think finding ways in which you can actually establish links or connections between the city center and its peripheries is extremely important. Another element that for us was extremely important in the report that we developed had to do with the way that ravines and water management actually has to become an integral part of the larger sort of infrastructural sphere of the city, and that it can actually be in many ways integrated with transport infrastructure. And this is sort of in many ways the calamity of Mexico City. A large amount of ravines along the western hills that actually come to the lowest point and get canalized and then drained. Sort of the water comes from the Pacific, gets drained into the Gulf. And of course, this puts a lot of pressure in these points. And primarily today, the drainage system is a system that has collapsed. The city is actually sinking drastically because of subsidence. And a new sort of water management and drainage paradigm has to be introduced into the city. So for us, this is a project that was then developed in relationship to that. This was done by one of our collaborators, Noam Davir, which began to look at the way that the metro infrastructure, primarily the stations, on the one hand can actually also begin to act as water management strategies that can control, establish retaining pools, clean the water that's coming out down from the mountain, but also establish a link between sort of higher level, between neighborhoods that are sort of along the higher edges of the ravines, and the ravines also as a new space for recreation in the city. That the ravines that today are the places where sort of most of the trash gets thrown and is seen as the back of the city can actually be recuperated as an important sphere of public space. And of course, the third one for us had to do with the way that sort of monorail, so the introduction of the monorail line in conjunction with post-industrial areas. In fact, Mexico City is a city that has large amounts of post-industrial areas. Mario Shetland, a very well-known landscape architect in the city who actually wrote a very nice piece in the book, has done significant projects in terms of transforming brownfields within the city. But for us, a large amount of the post-industrial area can actually be rethought in terms of new sites for denser housing. One of the biggest issues that Mexico City has is that housing developers have sort of speculated enormously with land along the periphery of the city. So they continued buying land sort of farther and farther and farther away from the center, building sort of repetitive houses. And what happened is that they were so far from places of work, from places of leisure, that people preferred to abandon the house they bought and and rent a small room in the center than to actually commute 3 hours in and 3 hours out. Which, by the way, that commute is the largest sort of loss of human capital in many Latin American cities. So for us, the idea of actually introducing the monorail is not only to be able to allow for people to get sort of faster from point A to point B, but that the infrastructure might also become as a backbone that can also introduce new denser configurations of affordable housing, primarily in post-industrial land, that today would be very easily transformable into residential corridors. The work was actually sort of first delivered as a report and then delivered in this book that came out a few months ago. And finally, I think sort of the third component for me, which is extremely important, is actually teaching and the role that sort of studio pedagogy has in defining the instrumental and methodological diversity that our discipline has in relationship to the built environment. I think that if there's one component that for me is extremely important today is that if in the first half of the 20th century urbanism was extremely dogmatic. There was one or two ways of actually examining the city, and urban design was seen as sort of the project that looked at intermediate space between buildings. Today, it's much less about a particular ideology, and it's much more about a very broad canvas of methods and strategies that respond to very specific scenarios. And they go all the way from sort of the restructuring of the historic core to the extension of new cities, to the creation of new cities. And I think today the discipline is much better placed to confront issues of fast-paced urbanization than it's ever been. In that sense, I'm extremely optimistic about the state of architecture in relationship to the city today. So that, and I presented this very briefly as sort of an introduction of what I've actually in many ways been up to in the last year and a half or two. But what I actually want to present more in detail, I want to choose one project and present it more in detail. And it's this one, which is a line in the Andes, an applied research project that, as I mentioned before, looks at the introduction of the first metro line in the city of, in the history of the city of Quito in Ecuador, a project developed also through the South America Project, which is this initiative that was also described by Darren in the introduction. And just to tell you a little bit the story or the background of this project, throughout the last 3 or 4 years, I've been the advisor of the former mayor now. That's a story I'll get into in a second, because of course we cannot divide sort of urbanism from politics. But I was an advisor to the former mayor on a series of projects. And he came up to me. So the city was already sort of thinking about a metro. They were starting to do a series of preliminary studies. They had already set up a partnership with Metro de Madrid, who was doing all the technical studies. And he goes, you know, we need an urban study. Do you think you can come up with something in 2 or 3 weeks? But we need it urgently. It's, the IDB will not give us sort of approval for the loans if we do not have an urban study in our package. I looked at him and I said, you know, I'm sure somebody can give you an urban study in 2 weeks, but I think you're framing this wrong. I think you actually have it completely wrong. And he wasn't thrilled about that, but he gave me the chance to continue the argument. And I said, you know, you're about to invest $2.5 billion, the largest infrastructural investment in the history of the city, and you actually want a 2-week urban study of sort of capacities at each station and how sort of the stations could actually be inserted in a corner. No, I think you need to make the metro project not about solving a transportation deficiency. You need to make the metro project not only about solving a transportation deficiency. You need to make the metro project as the backbone of the most ambitious urbanistic plan the city has had in its history. And I think that if you actually take a little longer, maybe 6 months to a year, but frame it in that way, not only are you going to get a better study, but I think the citizenry is going to be able to buy the metro project much better because, of course, in a city like Quito, many people are not thrilled about the idea that $2.5 billion are going to be invested in a metro. So for me, it was actually very important that these two ideas, metro as a transportation system and metro as a device to construct the city, to build city, are not seen separate and that they're not seen synchronically, that they're actually seen diachronically and that they're thought simultaneously with each other. And this was sort of the initial premise of the project. So here you begin to see it. There it is. That's the line. 22 kilometers in 15 stations in 22 kilometers. Located in a perch valley. I always say it's the highest metro in the world because it's 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet above sea level. In a fully built city, right? There you go. That's going to be built from scratch in the context of 4 years. So for us, the initial task was actually to look at the effect that this infrastructure would have in the city. But before starting to look at the metro, for us, it was very important to see how a colonial city, right, founded in the mid-1500s with 400 men, and a drawing, because that's one of the great things about the Spanish colonial city. There were a series of requirements, and one of them was that you actually needed to have a plan. And I'll show the plan in a second. Not something very elaborate, but the Spanish crown would not allow a Spanish-American city to be founded if a drawing was not drawn. And that actually, of course, allowed to build the logic for the law of Indies, and gave, I'll go more in detail into this, but gave a very clear consistency. If you go into any Latin American city, from really Spanish America, there are two things you have in common. The language and the original grid, where the three powers are always, or in most cases, placed in the exact same location. Mexico City is actually an exception. So for us, it was actually very important to understand how we had gone from that city into a 3 million people metropolis, sort of that extends over a perch valley, and today is now draping towards the lower valleys. Just to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of the topography, here you're talking about 20,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 7,000 feet. So there are major sectional differences from the highest point to the lowest point. So for us, we actually first started doing these drawings. These were more sort of impressionistic renditions of the city, but that for us were very telling. And they were actually very telling because a city that on the one hand seems extremely continuous because of the effect, the panorama, the effect of the panorama, right? Because you actually always get expansive views of the cities. It feels extremely continuous. But in reality, once you begin to draw the sections because of the geography and because of the cavity of the mountains, it is a very discontinuous geography, which means that there's already, even though people don't understand it, or don't perceive it on a day-to-day basis, a very large investment in bridging infrastructure, in mobility infrastructure, that perhaps is equivalent to a project like the metro, but that people, of course, it doesn't register in the way that that sort of a singular project like the metro would. And of course, here you have the figure of the city today, the historic core, what I call the compact extension of the early 20th century, and then the current extensions in the lower valleys along here. So, of course, for the first half of the project, for us, it was very important to begin to understand, similar to the Mexico City project, to construct a graphic biography of the city, to really begin to understand what was the city made out of. And we actually began to look at a series of categories. The first one, of course, the foundational city. And we began to do this drawing, which looks very simple, but actually there are thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of work here, where we actually decided to build a Noli map, a contemporary Noli map of the historic core, highlighting all the important civic, primarily religious buildings. This is a historic core that was primarily built by the Catholic Church, but that actually begins to highlight the legacy of the historic core. Quito has, and some people might disagree with me, but the most important colonial historic core of all of South America. But many people don't know it, right? Because when you live in the city, sometimes you forget about the virtues of your city. And for us, the idea of constructing this drawing was to show people, and of course this drawing was exhibited extensively in the city, to really show what was the value of this of the historic core. And here you can see an inventory of all the significant buildings across the center, most of them from sort of from the 1600s or 1700s, except a modernist school, which I actually love and decided to include it into this. It's done by a very well-known Uruguayan architect, Guillermo Jones de Rosola, who actually migrated to Ecuador and did the main pilot plan for the city in the 1940s. So if the first cut had to do with sort of the typologies of the historic core, the second one had to do with the larger morphology. How did the historic core sort of begin to take shape? And I think this is what I was talking before. We began to look at sort of the relevance of certain ideal cities from the 1600 and 1700, primarily Scamozzi's Palma Nova, and the ideal military cities of the 1600s, which in combination, 1500s, 1600s, which in combination with the Roman camp, right, became the basis for the Latin American city, and the development of a monastic block that was 100 varas by 100 varas, approximately 100 meters by 100 meters. It changes from city to city because at the time, of course, in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s measurements were not as precise as they are today. So in some cases, some cities, 100 varas equal today to 80 meters. In others, they equal to 120 meters. But on average, is about 100 meter by 100 meter, which was the ideal dimension to be able to introduce a monastery in a single block. And then from that ideal dimension, the block actually got subdivided. Here you can begin to see the logic of the monasteries, and then how it actually got subdivided into fractals to begin to move from a scale, an institutional scale, into a domestic scale, right? So then you begin to use the logic of the courtyard and what's called the Sajuan, which is a passageway from the street into the inner courtyard to be able to give access to courtyards that don't have access to the street. And it's quite amazing to see the process, the fragmentation process. I mean, it's actually, I think, one of the first better examples of parametric architecture. We began to look at the relationship of the rigidity of the block in relationship to topography. And I think some of these blocks for me are quite amazing because they begin to show how, for example, the movement of water begins to shape some of that morphology. And that's very clear, sort of how the grid, of course, can control and in many ways domesticate many things except the movement of water. Water always follows gravity, and you can see it very clearly here. And then, of course, the arrival of of non-religious architecture that begins to happen within the peripheries of the historic core. The hospital, the sanatorium, the panopticon, and of course the cemetery. All elements that did not fit within the grid that began to sort of construct the periphery of the city. One of the most beautiful, not a museum, but one of the most beautiful hospitals in all of, from the 1800s in all of Latin America. So if we actually begin to look at the history of the historic core, we actually have the topography, the introduction of the grid, residual spaces outside of the grid, open spaces that are not part of the inner blocks, large public plazas defined as sort of an element of the block, inner patios and courtyards, and then, of course, the religious buildings as sort of this palimpsest that makes up the ground of the city. And then, of course, here I always like to show this this image, which is sort of one of these blocks that, for me, is actually the perfect relationship between typology and morphology. The bullfighting ring. Both Aldo Rossi and Muratori would have fought over for this block, even though they always used to argue that. One argued that typology was more important, Rossi, of course, Muratori that morphology. But I think today, this block, for me, argues that they're both equally important and that they both have to be thought simultaneously. The third sort of component of the research began to look at the expansions of the 20th century. The city sort of outside of the historic block, which actually transformed sort of the grid into a linear city, a city of avenues, that actually extends approximately 17 kilometers long. Here's the historic core. And that has its densest neighborhoods within the south of the city, which is generally seen as the informal and as the poor part of the city. But in reality, it's one of the most sort of vibrant and active cities. And I always like to show this project, which for me is quite amazing. It's called Quitumbe. It was originally an affordable housing project sponsored by the government, but the government ran out of money once they had actually laid out streets and parcels. So everything that, once they ran out of money, people actually self-built it. It is one of the most successful housing projects. One, because the government did exactly what they had to do. They had to actually provide an organization. In many ways, it's like if they would have actually read John Turner and John Habraken's books on Lima. They actually provided a framework for property ownership, public space, and circulation. And they actually provided a very, because of course these were supposed to be single-family homes, a very tight grid, parcel structure that then allow for people to build their homes systematically over time. Today, this is the most, the densest, sort of one of the densest neighborhoods in the city and one of the most successful ones. And of course, what's also interesting is that it actually follows the 100-meter by 100-meter block, which even though it was not mandated by regulation, became very prominent throughout the entire city. It's a dimension that actually got adopted consistently throughout the city, in different variations, but consistently throughout the city. And then, of course, the last part of the research began to look at the relationship of the city in terms of its larger sort of valley valley structure. Sort of here you begin to see sort of the proposed metro line, the historic core, the upper valley, and then the newer geographies around the lower valleys that are being urbanized. And of course, extremely important, the movement of the old airport, which was, I used to love it because it was like a train station 2 blocks away from my house. I am from Quito, by the way. I didn't mention this earlier. But of course, it was very dangerous. So now the airport has actually moved to a new airport, which is creating a brand new dynamic in terms of the relationship of the upper level and the lower level. Here we begin to see some of the dynamics that work at a territorial scale. For example, the fact that the 3 major oil pipelines that the country has to move oil from the Amazon to the refinery in the Pacific actually cross through the city. And this is something that a lot of people don't even know, that sort of a large percentage of the income of the country is actually going through a tube underneath their house. Looking at networks, for example, like electrification, sort of the energy network, which actually sort of begins to show what are the continuities and discontinuities in terms of public services within the region. Issues of water. and how over time, right, from the 50s until today, water has been sort of been pumped to the city from farther and farther away, all the way to today, where sort of water is being pumped from the Amazon. The relationship of the city to sort of different forms of public transport. And finally, a large sort of synthetic drawing that begins to bring all of these networks together and that puts the metro project as the spine, right, as the main spine of a very complex set of navigational systems and scales that make up the contemporary city. And in that sense, for me, this was one of the most interesting discoveries of the project, which was that sort of Quito has two key projects, two key lines that have to be developed. The first one is the metro line, and you can see it, it's drawn there. But the second one is this more amorphous line right there. And the reason why I think this second line is important is because until now, if you ever asked anyone who lived in Quito if the city had a river, they would answer no. Because the river was sort of, the Machangara River was this sort of odd canal where the entire city drains, extremely polluted water, that was along the edge of the linear city, but never part of the larger sort of psychology of the city. And I had actually had the discussions with the mayor and told him that sort of equally as important as the metro line is actually the introduction of a water treatment plant that can actually clean this river, because the state of the water, and it's not just sort of used water from sort of regular sort of residential use. All of the heavy industry of the south drains into this. I mean, if you fall into this river, you melt. And of course, the response of the mayor, as mayors generally tend to say, was that it is very controversial. He didn't say he didn't want to do it, but it's very controversial to actually build a water treatment plant because people don't see it. And when people don't see it, you don't gain votes. And of course, he didn't say it so directly, but that was the line. And I said, that is absolutely true. But I don't think you need to sell it as a water treatment plant. I think what's important is that the city is no longer a linear city. The linear city is actually becoming a figure eight with these lower valleys that are sort of densifying at an unprecedented rate. So in a way, this line, which today is this derelict river, can become also the main epicenter that begins to reorganize the relationship between the upper valley and the lower valley. And that actually can become a very important park at a metropolitan scale. And that doesn't mean you're going to sort of put amenities all throughout the 40 kilometers, but it can actually be seen, once again, as something that ties, that creates a front rather than two backs in the context of the city. And it's actually a project that now is being studied and possibly developed in conjunction with a series of cable cars that will link the upper level to the lower level. So as we moved forward with the research, another very important component of the study actually had to do with showing people in the city what sort of metro culture really is, what sort of a subway culture really is. Because if you really think about it, it's a city that has no tradition of rail. We had sort of a small train that went from Quito to Guayaquil to the coast in the 1920s. But shortly thereafter, sort of trucks, private mobility became sort of very prominent, and really rail culture is non-existent in the city. So we actually also, as part of the work, began to sort of show how certain metro systems have evolved over time, that it's not something that sort of happens from one day to the next. But more importantly, and I think for me this is one of the most important slides, is that it is very possible to actually make exceptional urban projects out of infrastructure projects. That when you begin to think them simultaneously, you can actually deliver a great quantity and quality of collective space in a city that comes from effectively reorganizing the residual spaces of geometry. And I think for me, these are two exceptional projects. One is the Madrid Rio by West 8 and Ginés Garrido, where they actually took a terrible engineering project. And not to beat on engineers, there are some engineers that are fantastic, but in this case, the city had actually just taken all the highways that went through the river and sank them without even asking if that traffic had to continue to go through the center of the river. They just said, let's expand the capacity by 200%, sink it, forget about it. And once they did that, they were like, oh, what are we going to do now with the space that we've sort of rescued? They basically very quickly called for a competition, and I think that this team did an exceptional job in reutilizing the geometries of a very expensive and in many ways an effective engineering project and turn it into an exceptional public amenity. I think in a much more, I would say, sophisticated and a strategic manner, Weissman-Freddy and the Seattle Olympic Sculpture Park use one singular move, basically what's one sort of a glorified bridge, to be able to link three parcels that were completely disconnected by mobility infrastructure, and in doing so, actually give a completely new access to the museum and the city to the waterfront. And I think this is the kind of synthetic thinking that I think architects can actually bring into the discussion of the city that becomes extremely important. So that was sort of the initial sort of research phase of the project, and within that framework, we then began to develop a plan for the city. And here you can begin to see the metro line. And for us, this might seem actually counterintuitive to the project, but it was very important to break the line. That the line of the metro would only be successful if it had another system that would actually integrate it with other geometries within the city. Of course, it's a very thin and narrow city. One single spine resolves a lot of issues, but we cannot forget that even in its narrowest point, the city is 5 kilometers wide. So walking that with grocery bags is not that pleasant. There has to be other systems. There has to be a larger sort of integrated transport system that can actually link to the project. And we actually proposed that we would create the city into a series of 13 loops, and that these loops would always connect to 2 subway stations. The loops would be made of existing streets. Sometimes they would be made of sort of larger promenades. Sometimes you might have to actually cut through a certain fabric to be able to complete the loop. But that then this became the loops that actually had a rapid bus transit system that allowed for people to move from the higher edges of the city to the stations. But they also became the element that began to define a scale of urban project that could actually begin to rethink district by district. There we go. Here you begin to see them in relationship to the many different layers that actually make up the city: large-scale public parks, street grid, existing sort of linear parks. There you begin to see it sort of by levels. All the drainage that exists in the city. One thing that's extremely important is that because it's a perch valley, you have a lot of drainage infrastructure that sits above the subway. So the subway is an extremely deep subway. It's 30 meters below the surface, which is generally seen as a terrible thing. Today, the most effective subways are the ones that are as close to the surface as possible, but those are also the most expensive, especially when you're not following a street grid, when you're actually building underneath private property. So basically, here you begin to see then the metro. This is the same drawing I showed before, and these then became the loops that actually began to rethink this new network of urban projects throughout the city. This is one that we've actually worked more in detail. This is the historic core, where we argued that basically through the introduction of the metro line, which will have a stop right in the center, has been very controversial, and UNESCO is being very difficult, but I think we'll get it through. But not only can you actually create this loop, but you can also begin to rescale the infrastructures along the center. So for example, the old major sort of bus terminal has already been torn down, and this is becoming a new kind of glacier, a new kind of ring that begins to introduce sort of public space for the historic core, but also begins to introduce a series of amenities that you cannot fit into the historic core to give it a new lease on life. So for example, a new large-scale exhibition hall, certain parking facilities, they all begin to happen along the edge that then allow for the center to gain sort of new programs and new uses. Another component that for us was also very important was the role that certain key buildings would actually allow you to shift in topography from higher levels to lower levels. And here you begin to see sort of one of these loops, but also the way that these loops begin to work in section in such a way that you might actually be able to move from higher levels to lower levels. And then from there, we actually began to develop a series of specific, sort of perhaps more speculative projects about the metro. One is sort of this one that begins to look at how the 100-meter by 100-meter block, a dimension that's still extremely usable and sort of has a lot of potential in the city, can actually be reconfigured to rethink higher densities and to also to adapt it to particular topographic conditions. And this is a sort of a study that sort of began to look at a wide array of densities and what were the maximum and minimum capacities that this block, that this dimension could contain with sort of contemporary building typologies, and how those could actually then be applied in areas of the sort of the compact capital of the city that today sort of can accommodate a greater degree in density. Another sort of issue that we began to look at had to do with the way that the stations themselves can actually begin to provide, through an air right system, mechanisms for new mixed-use urban projects to be developed. And here you can begin to see, this is El Recreo station, where we were actually proposing sort of for new mixed-use commercial, in this case, educational facilities, to actually be integrated into the station. Another series of proposals from for the same site, where we actually argued that once again the reorganization of land, where you have to insert the box for the metro, can actually begin to serve as a framework where you can actually reparcel the air rights and introduce a new scale of residential grain, always also connecting the higher levels with the lower levels. And recuperating some of the ravines that exist in the city, which, similar to Mexico City, today are completely abandoned, but could actually become very important spaces, open spaces within the city, very important spaces also for the management of water. Another sort of idea that we actually began to look at has to do with the, in a way, one of the stations that actually is at the entrance of the historic core, and how would you actually begin to deal with this station, primarily in terms of creating a new sort of public plaza on top, but also mitigating this issue of depth. The metro is on average 30 meters below the ground, but in the historic core, UNESCO has said that they'll only allow the metro to go underneath the historic core if it's 50 meters. One, because they don't want to deal with the sort of the vibration and the structure and sort of failure in terms of the structures above. Two, they also don't want to deal with archaeological sites. But it's a little bit backwards to actually go that deep. Oh, and UNESCO has said that they'll only allow it if the tunnel is hand dug. So it's going to be complicated. But I actually think that that opens then an opportunity to be able to rethink programs. One, to be able to bring natural light. I think one thing that's essential when you actually have a subway that's so deep is that you actually find ways in which you can bring a certain amount, not much, but a certain amount of natural light into the boxes, but also the way that certain programs, primarily collective programs, libraries, mediatheks, rec centers, could actually also occupy these spaces so that it's not that you're going through basically a vacuum cut and fill as you go towards the station. So once we had developed the entire project, we actually constructed this drawing, which is a worm's eye view of the city, not a bird's eye view, but a worm's eye view. So of course you see the river on the opposite side. arguing that perhaps the least interesting thing that the city could actually do was to develop a master plan for the metro. That what the city should actually do is to actually use the metro as a spine that collects a series of small and intermediate scale projects, the loops in addition to a series of sort of very strategic projects that over time can actually consolidate into a larger vision. I think another component that for us was important was that these loops and these programs can actually happen without the metro building, without the metro being constructed. So this work was actually introduced as sort of delivered as a report, but then it was actually transformed into a book, which I showed an image before. And within that book, we actually asked a series of scholars from Latin America, architects and scholars from within Latin America, to actually contribute to the book. And this was extremely important because it was important for the city and for its citizens to actually see that the project is of relevance outside of the city, that it's a huge investment, and that if it's actually done correctly, the city can actually be redefined as a model for other cities. So we had people like Martín Covas from Uruguay, who actually wrote a fantastic essay on the history of Jones Odriozola, who did the main plan for Quito in 1942. But then other essays from people like Ana María Durán Calisto, which actually wrote, I think, one of the most controversial essays in the book, which was where she argued that if political vision and design vision are not aligned, projects don't happen. And that in the case of Curitiba, it was very easy because the mayor was both an architect and the mayor of the city, so he could bring those two very effectively. But then she goes into highlighting certain cases. For example, all of you guys have heard of the success of Medellin. A lot of those ideas were actually tested in a city like in Caracas first, but there was really no political momentum to build them, and they got built in Medellin first. And then Caracas has implemented a few. But it shows how important it is for sort of political leadership and design leadership to be aligned, and that is very important for these two to come together in the context of the Metro project. This was launched as a major exhibition in the city. It was actually very well received by the mayor. We see the mayor there looking at the work. And it was actually quite widely distributed through, the publication and the report was distributed through press. The citizenry actually got very engaged with the project. What happened? So where does the project stand now? I think is an interesting way to conclude. The mayor lost re-election. The mayor lost re-election not because of the Metro project. The Metro project was fantastic, and the urban plan was exceptional. But he actually lost re-election because he was from the same political party as the president, who has my same last name, but there's no relationship whatsoever, Rafael Correa. And Rafael Correa is a very charismatic leader that did a lot of campaigning for the mayor. And one of the biggest lessons that I actually learned through that process is that people want mayors. They don't want employees of the president. And basically, the campaign the president did affected enormously the mayor's popularity. He lost. A very young guy, who's 40. He was 2 years older than me in high school. Ran, and nobody thought he was going to win. He won. And what's interesting is that he actually opposed the project, and he wanted to dismantle the Metro project. Said it was too expensive. He said that sort of there are light rail systems that would actually be much more effective, which is not true because in a Perch Valley city like Quito, capacity is at a maximum. Quito was one of the first cities to introduce rapid transit bus in the 80s, and it really doesn't have the capacity. And so he opposed the project, and the citizenry, to a greater degree, rebelled and had to change his mind. And I think that this proves something that's quite exceptional, which is that good projects can actually survive political times. And that if you actually develop projects that have a certain level of that are integral and that bring into the table many different facets, you can actually sort of overcome a lot of political opposition. And this was the case with this project. 2 weeks ago, the mayor announced that it's going to be built. It's It's being funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, by the World Bank, and by the Corporación Andina de Fomento, which is a local version of the World Bank. First time in the history of Latin America that the three lending institutions team up for a project. And we'll see what happens in the next 5 to 7 years. The two end stations have already sort of broken ground. And now they're actually, this debate, actually the two end stations had already broken ground with the previous mayor. The debate was about the line. So if the mayor would have actually gone through without sort of supporting the project, we would have ended up with two great end stations, but no metro. Finally, to conclude, I think the last thing that I would say in relationship to this project is that this was actually done through an academic platform. It was actually done through the GSD and through Harvard. And that, I think, raised two important issues. One, it didn't scare people because it was framed as an academic project. So nobody was scared that their house was going to be torn down the next day. Two, it actually generated a large amount of ideas rather than one plan. And at this particular moment in time, the city needed that. And that was very effective. And the third one, which is for me the most important one, and the one that I would actually want to leave you with, is that even though people say the academy is not the real world, it has a great, great influence in it. And what you guys do, design sort of actions have consequences, and what you guys do here every day, even if it's in the context of a studio project, even if it's in the context of a seminar, ideas travel, ideas translate, and ideas have relevance. And I think this is the perfect example that what we actually do in a building like this one actually is of great relevance to many people outside. So never underestimate what you do. Thank you.